Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, global markets reporter at Nasdaq. Joining us at the market site in Times Square, we have Bob Petrie, co-founder and CEO of Origami Risk. We're going to take a look at the key findings from the 2022 State of Risk Report and what this could mean for compliance leaders, members of the board, for both public and private organizations. Bob, it's great to have you with us. Welcome to Market Site.
Oh, thank you, Jill. Nice to be here.
What is the State of the Risk Report?
Well, the State of the Risk Report really started from a view that we're getting from our clients that they are really starting to think differently about risk in the world today. And if you think about it, between the pandemic, the terrorist attack in New York City, the war in Europe, supply chain issues, a massive increase in cyber attacks, global warming, right, climate change, the list of topics goes on and on. And so we knew that corporate executives were thinking differently about risk and decided to explore the topic in some more detail. So we did an extensive amount of research for the report. We interviewed, we got 220 respondents to the survey who answered. We had more than 15 hours of private interviews and spoke with dozens of analysts and other experts in the industry and sort of compiled the list of findings that we sort of put into our inaugural report that was published a couple of months ago.
Yeah, I mean, it really is quite remarkable. Every day it almost feels like there's another key issue that comes up in the middle of creating this report. There's just so much that's happened in the past 6 months. What was the biggest takeaway from the report?
Well, the biggest takeaway was that we saw that the cohort of people that responded to our survey really divided themselves in the way they answered their questions into two groups that we sort of deemed leaders or laggards. So leaders were people that had made investments in risk technology in recent years that really helped them to pull together an enterprise-wide view of data and integrated these different silos of data that were the place today. The laggards, the other group, they consisted, leaders were about 25% of the total respondents, and laggards were about 53%. And what they reported was really ad hoc investments in technology and sort of siloed approach to systems. And so we first identified those two groups, and then we explored the way they answered sort of other questions about how they thought about risk. And so a couple of really interesting findings sort of emerged from that. The first was that leaders really had a much more proactive view of risk. They thought about risk they might be facing and were able to pivot quickly when faced with a new issue. And the laggards really were more about sort of recognizing a risk after it happened and responding in whatever fashion sort of made sense at the time, as opposed to thinking ahead and planning and being strategic about it. So two really different outlooks on risk. Not surprising that organizations are changing at different levels of speed, given how fast the environment around them is changing. But we're seeing clear leaders emerge and clear folks that are sort of waiting to take the next step.
What did you learn about ESG?
ESG is on everybody's mind. 80% plus of respondents related a medium or a high priority. But they also don't know a lot about what it means for their organization yet. Lots of ambiguity. So people are using spreadsheets and are asking each other and us questions about what may come first and what happens after that. But I think we're going to need more regulatory clarity before we have an answer on ESG.
Yeah, it's challenging, especially it's not standardized, and of course it's very subjective.
And it's different in U.S. and Europe.
Right,
very much
right.
So.
Well, there's that also. With the shock that we experienced in the supply chain this year as a result of the pandemic, what we're seeing in Russia and Ukraine, how was this reflected in the report?
So the same theme of leaders and laggards also played out in supply chain. So more than 50% of the respondents told us that they'd made changes to their supply chain or their compliance management process internally, whereas less than 40% of respondents of the laggards had reported making such changes. So clearly, thinking ahead and being proactive, part of the theme of leaders and laggards, was playing out of supply chain issues as well.
What takeaways do you have specifically for organizational leaders?
I think the takeaway for organizational leaders is that it's really hard in today's world to make good decisions without data. And the data that exists in your organizations is siloed, it sits in many different places. It's really hard to pull it together to produce interesting insights. And so my advice would be, look at what the leaders are doing, the cohort that we identified in our survey, and think really hard about how to build more capability to understand and analyze risk, which will then give you the ability to mitigate and reduce the cost of that risk over time.
What would you suggest as we look ahead and to really take into account from the results of the State of the Risk Report?
I think the world, the war in Ukraine, the latest of the long set of events that were really shocking to the world, is clearly not the last issue. And so I think that what's going to happen is that there's a divergence of views, right? We've got leaders who are thinking ahead, Well, I think they're going to pull the rest of the world a little bit forward. We see this in every sort of adoption of technology. But I see really just a one-way process to where people are understanding that meeting their strategic objectives requires understanding the risks that stand in their way and thinking about ways to build tools and analysis that help them better manage that risk.
All right, Bob, we appreciate the insight. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.